Hello, everyone. Welcome to Dr. Deep State. This segment today is entitled 1984 and Fatima, and I want to talk about totalitarianism, which is a theme that works itself throughout the book In Pursuit of the Metaverse. It's Metaverse Monday on our local station, so I thought I'd take a slice of our programming from locals, links are in the description, and put it up here on YouTube for everyone. So what I'm going to do is talk a bit about totalitarianism. And the reason I'm doing this is as we're in a world of war and rumors of war, I think the fog of war can cloud our perception of reality. It's a theme we deal with extensively. And I want to talk a bit about totalitarianism. And I want to finish today with a little bit about the Fatima message and how it speaks, I believe, to our day and to the general theme of totalitarianism. So what I'm going to do and what I generally do on the channel here is it's sort of a perpetual message from the last 8 years, pulling the two books together, seeing through the Singularity and In Pursuit of the Metaverse. So the ideas I'm pulling together today will be presented on Locals on Wednesday when we connect the dots to other current events going on, and again on Memory Hold Friday. So that's kind of the general theme for what we're doing. But 1984, the time is now. I believe there are certain concepts within totalitarianism that are perennial, and again, some that are unique to the techno age that we're living in today. And what we did last week on Metaverse Monday is we were working from chapter 3 of the book In Pursuit of the Metaverse, and we mentioned the concept from Carl Schmitt, and this comes from the year 1922, and he reminds us that all modern, and when he's talking about modern, he's especially talking about the 20th century. All modern theory of the state are repackaged secular concepts that are essentially at its core and originally theological concepts. So the reason that's going to be significant is when we speak about reality here, we're talking about a Catholic notion of reality, because the Catholic Church, that's one of the claims, that it represents most fully the concept of reality. So what we're arguing is there are forces in the world that are trying to pull us out of the fullness of that reality and into an alternative reality. The book is entitled Millennial Dream. So part of that is perverting this traditional concept of the millennium, political religion, and political religion indeed repackages these theological ideas and puts them into the secular political realm. And ultimately, the aim here is toward building a technical utopia. And so that fits in with the theme of everything from AI to transhumanism to the surveillance state. And I want to briefly end on words from Fatima that I think pertain to this dilemma. So, it's been a dramatic week for us in terms of the ideas of a pending war, rumors of war, and how the different characters put together. What's the true cause of this war? Can we know the true cause of any war? And again, I think within the cloud of war, there are conditions that Carl Schmitt would call state of exception positions, where new concepts are going to be repackaged and there's going to be a new presentation, what we oftentimes refer to as a new normal. And this often happens in the switching from one hegemonic power to another. And so we could use Carl Schmitt's ideas to identify the state of exception after World War I, after World War II. And I think we need to kind of think about that right now, because what I'm going to argue is we might want to consider what's going on in the media, in current events, from a traditional vantage point, and maybe even a deep state, sort of Schmittian vantage point that can kind of maybe help us see through some of the fog of war. So, what I'd like to do right now is present an article that was delivered just a couple days ago. And it does take 12 minutes, but it's very interesting. This is from Chris Hedges. The introduction will be in the article. And a couple things to make note. He's going to use this idea that part of the objective of a totalitarian regime is to make the individuals that are subject to the regime lose a sense of reality. It's actually, there are multiple techniques, ancient and modern, to do that. So he's going to use the word reality. When I finish, I'm going to remind us that I'm going to pull us back to a ecclesial church understanding of reality, but he's going to use the term as it's used sort of in everyday language. Also note that he'll make reference to Eric Voegelin, and that is, I use his collective works throughout many of the chapters in here, and I also explore many of his ideas of the movement from reality into second reality. So without further ado, I will put the article before us.
The Rule of Idiots. In the last days of all empires, the idiots take over. They mirror the collective stupidity of a civilization that has detached itself from reality. Written by Chris Hedges for the Chris Hedges Report, chrishedges.substack.com. Narrated by Eunice Wong. The last days of dying empires are dominated by idiots. The Roman, Mayan, French, Habsburg, Ottoman, Romanov, Iranian, and Soviet dynasties crumbled under the stupidity of their decadent rulers, who absented themselves from reality, plundered their nations, and retreated into echo chambers, where fact and fiction were indistinguishable. Donald Trump and the sycophantic buffoons in his administration are updated versions of the reigns of the Roman Emperor Nero, who allocated vast state expenditures to attain magical powers. The Chinese Emperor Qin Shi Huang, who funded repeated expeditions to a mythical island of immortals to bring back a potion that would give him eternal life, and a feckless czarist court that sat around reading tarot cards and attending seances as Russia was decimated by a war that consumed over 2 million lives and revolution brewed in the streets.
If you're wondering how I score top essay marks like these in university, one of my secret weapons is asking Grammarly.
In Hitler and the Germans, the political philosopher Eric Voegelin dismisses the idea that Hitler, gifted in oratory and political opportunism but poorly educated and vulgar, mesmerized and seduced the German people. The Germans, he writes, supported Hitler and the grotesque marginal figures surrounding him because he embodied the pathologies of a diseased society, one beset by economic collapse and hopelessness. Voegelin defines stupidity as a loss of reality. The loss of reality means a stupid person cannot rightly orient his action in the world in which he lives. The demagogue, who is always an idiot, is not a freak or social mutation. The demagogue expresses the society's zeitgeist, its collective departure from a rational world of verifiable fact. These idiots, who promise to recapture lost glory and power, do not create, they only destroy. They accelerate the collapse. Limited in intellectual ability, lacking any moral compass, grossly incompetent, and filled with rage at established elites, who they see as having slighted and rejected them, they remake the world into a playground for grifters, con artists, and megalomaniacs. They make war on universities, banish scientific research, peddle quack theories about vaccines as a pretext to expand mass surveillance and data sharing, strip legal residents of their rights. and empower armies of goons, which is what the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, has become, to spread fear and ensure passivity. Reality, whether the climate crisis or the immiseration of the working class, does not impinge on their fantasies. The worse it gets, the more idiotic they become. Hannah Arendt blames a society that willingly embraces radical evil on this collective thoughtlessness, desperate to escape from the stagnation where they and their children are trapped, hopeless, and in despair. A betrayed population is conditioned to exploit everyone around them in a desperate scramble to advance. People are objects to be used, mirroring the cruelty inflicted by the ruling class. A society convulsed by disorder and chaos, as Vogelin points out, celebrates the morally degenerate, those who are cunning, manipulative, deceitful, and violent. In an open democratic society, these attributes are despised and criminalized. Those who exhibit them are condemned as stupid. A man or woman who behaves in this way, Vogelin notes, will be socially boycotted. But the social, cultural, and moral norms in a diseased society are inverted. The attributes that sustain an open society, a concern for the common good, honesty, trust, and self-sacrifice, are ridiculed. They are detrimental to existence in a diseased society. When a society, as Plato notes, abandons the common good, it always unleashes amoral lusts, violence, greed, and sexual exploitation, and fosters magical thinking, the focus of my book, Empire of Illusion, the end of literacy and the triumph of spectacle. The only thing these dying regimes do well is spectacle. These bread and circus acts, like Trump's $40 million army parade to be held on his birthday on June 14th, keep a distressed population entertained. The Disneyfication of America, the land of eternally happy thoughts and positive attitudes, the land where everything is possible, is peddled to mask the cruelty of economic stagnation and social inequality. The population is conditioned by mass culture, dominated by sexual commodification, banal and mindless entertainment, and graphic depictions of violence, to blame itself for failure. Soren Kierkegaard, in The Present Age, warns that the modern state seeks to eradicate conscience and shape and manipulate individuals into a pliable and indoctrinated public. This public is not real. It is, as Kierkegaard writes, a monstrous abstraction, an all-embracing something which is nothing, a mirage. In short, we become part of a herd, unreal individuals who never are and never can be united in an actual situation or organization, and yet are held together as a whole. Those who question the public, those who denounce the corruption of the ruling class, are dismissed as dreamers, freaks, or traitors. But only they, according to the Greek definition of the polis, can be considered citizens. Thomas Paine writes that a despotic government is a fungus that grows out of a corrupt civil society. This is what happened to past societies. It is what happened to us. It's tempting to personalize the decay, as if ridding ourselves of Trump will return us to sanity and sobriety. But the rot and corruption has ruined all of our democratic institutions, which function in form, not in content. The consent of the governed is a cruel joke. Congress is a club on the take from billionaires and corporations. The courts are appendages of corporations and the rich. The press is an echo chamber of the elites, some of whom do not like Trump, but none of whom advocate the social and political reforms that could save us from despotism. It's about how we dress up despotism, not despotism itself. The historian Ramsay MacMullen, in Corruption and the Decline of Rome, writes that what destroyed the Roman Empire was the diverting of governmental force, its misdirection. Power became about enriching private interests. This misdirection renders government powerless, at least as an institution that can address the needs and protect the rights of the citizenry. Our government, in this sense, is powerless. It's a tool of corporations, banks, the war industry, and oligarchs. It cannibalizes itself to funnel wealth upwards.
I would say to another nonprofit.
The decline of Rome was the natural and inevitable effect of immoderate greatness, Edward Gibbon writes. Prosperity ripened the principle of decay. The cause of the destruction multiplied with the extent of conquest, and as soon as time or accident had removed the artificial supports, the stupendous fabric yielded to the pressure of its own weight. The story of the ruin is simple and obvious, and instead of inquiring why the Roman Empire was destroyed, we should rather be surprised that it had subsisted for so long. The Roman Emperor Commodus, like Trump, was entranced with his own vanity. He commissioned statues of himself as Hercules and had little interest in governance. He fancied himself a star of the arena, staging gladiatorial contests where he was crowned the victor and killing lions with a bow and arrow. The empire, he renamed Rome the Colonia Commodiana, colony of Commodus, was a vehicle to satiate his bottomless narcissism and lust for wealth. He sold public offices the way Trump sells pardons and favors to those who invest in his cryptocurrencies or donate to his inauguration committee or presidential library. Finally, the emperor's advisors arranged to have him strangled to death in his bath by a professional wrestler after he announced that he would assume the consulship dressed as a gladiator. But his assassination did nothing to halt the decline. Commodus was replaced by the reformer Pertinax, who was assassinated 3 months later. The Praetorian Guards auctioned off the office of emperor. The next emperor, Didius Julianus, lasted 66 days. There would be 5 emperors in 193 AD, the year after the assassination of Commodus. Like the late Roman Empire, our republic is dead. Our constitutional rights, due process, habeas corpus, privacy, freedom from exploitation, fair elections, and dissent, have been taken from us by judicial and legislative fiat. These rights exist only in name. The vast disconnect between the purported values of our faux democracy and reality means our political discourse, the words we use to describe ourselves and our political system, are absurd. Walter Benjamin wrote in 1940, amid the rise of European fascism and looming World War, a clay painting named Angelus Novus shows an angel looking as though he is about to move away from something he is fixedly contemplating. His eyes are staring, his mouth is open, his wings are spread. This is how one pictures the angel of history. His face is turned towards the past. Where we perceive a chain of events, he sees one single catastrophe, which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. The storm irresistibly propels him into the future, to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. This storm is what we call progress. Our decay, our illiteracy and collective retreat from reality was long in the making. The steady erosion of our rights, especially our rights as voters, the transformation of the organs of state into tools of exploitation, the immiseration of the working poor and middle class, the lies that saturate our airwaves, the degrading of public education, the endless and futile wars, the staggering public debt, the collapse of our physical infrastructure, mirror the last days of all empires. Trump the pyromaniac entertains us as we go down.
So I liked that because he's using a lot of terms I do, like a detachment from reality, a type of collective psychosis, and the concept of spectacle, all of which we explore here from a uniquely historical and Catholic perspective. And there are so many things I like that, but I think when we try to understand things that seem inexplicable, sometimes having a vantage point of this has happened before, there's sort of a pattern to all this. One thing that comes to mind is Trump Gaza. And for 2 years now, or however long it's been with this situation, I have no words. I don't understand how this could be happening on the world stage and the lack of response. And I guess I say this over and over and over, especially by people that call themselves Christian. I think putting it in a historical perspective and starting to think about totalitarianism and people subjected to that and the type of collective psychosis helps explain this conspiracy of silence about the situation around us. But this one really took the cake for me on top of these bodies. Somebody is actually going to permit this on their social media site. People with beards, belly dancing, idols to themselves. It was quite over the top. So thinking that this has happened before and there's a pattern to it helps. One of the things when we think of the Roman Empire compared to the American Empire is that in one sense, there's always been this attempt to recreate the Roman Empire. The Spanish tried to do it, the Pax Romana, English, the Anglican Empire, the Anglican Empire, but it was never really fully realized. Pax Britannica. It's never really, but I would argue what I call this empire of spectacle, that it's been transported into our phones and our mirrors and our media. And in fact, we are living in the ancient spectacle that St. Augustine and Tertullian recognized that was going on in the theaters and the amphitheaters of the ancient world. Now through modern technology, we've imbibed it all at a world level. So it's truly, and I think we saw that over the last 5 years, that it can penetrate into the minds, imagination, souls of members of the whole world. And when we think of that, we want to kind of, I think, use that as a frame to think about the wars that seem to be on the horizon. Because wars necessarily create, as Carl Schmitt would say, a state of exception condition where politics as normal is being manipulated and reframed in a time where, a word that we'll use again today, a vacuum has been created, a vacuum of power. And so that's part of the chaos as well. So what I would like to do right now is get a little crazy because I think this is getting lost in the search for information. We don't really know exactly what's going on in these countries. We see pictures of rockets but we don't exactly know. These are sort of closed situations. So I'm going to slightly introduce an idea, and on the locals this week in Connecting the Dots, I will revisit some of the information pertaining to this. But this is the idea that indeed much of this is theater. Much of the warfare, much of the diplomacy is theater. And I'm going to pop up the word here with the eye. And most people have seen this before, but I want us to slow down and look at what Albert Pike said. Now, allegedly, this was written in 1871, a letter sent to a correspondent in Italy. And so it's a little shaky. But I've been looking at this now for 12 years, and it's undeniable that what seems to be staged right now is something that appears to be Ezekiel 38 and 39. And that's another conversation, and how that seems to be that text, that scripture seems to be inverted. I just want us to look at one sentence in this phrase right here. And that is the fomenting, the manufacturing of a war. And here in this case, it says the third World War must be fomented by taking advantage of the differences caused by the agent tours of the Illuminati between the political Zionists and the leaders of the Islamic world. The war must be conducted in such a way that the Islamic world and political Zionism must mutually destroy one another. What I want to highlight there is that this is being staged, that we'd have to be able to think that it's even possible that the leaders of both are working in cahoots, both captured. And possibly there's an agent, like a cabal, that's removed from this, that's putting the psychosis even into the staged people. And it's hard to imagine, how could somebody pull this off? And for people that have kind of come around to this information, with the tall buildings 24 years ago, like how did they pull that off? The event 5 years ago, how did they pull that off? And what I'm going to present on Locals on Wednesday is who exactly are these people, these decision-making people over there, and is it realistic to think that it's possible that they are captured and part of the staging? Why go down this path to consider it? Because part of, I think, the agenda here with these ultimate totalitarians, they're operating now on the world stage. It's not just Trump. There's somebody behind all these powers that wants to build a worldwide collective psychosis under techniques that totalitarians have used forever and ever, with the advent of artificial intelligence, deep fakes, robotics, sixth generation warfare, etc. So with that in mind, I want to play just maybe 2 minutes of something from Oswald Spengler. And this is an idea of Caesar. So there was an idea kind of floated around last year of Trump being this Caesar character. And this is an idea of Spengler. He's writing this about 100 years ago. And it's very much of a secular perspective that civilizations have this utterly sort of predictable trajectory in their rise and fall. And this will also kind of help put, I think, the craziness of our times in a historical perspective. But I also want to make kind of a suggestion out of left field on this one. So I want to introduce the topic and let it run for a couple minutes here.
And finally culminated in the rise of Julius Caesar, where Caesarism gets its name.
Ya comenzó la venta Stars and Stripes de Ashley. Convierte tu casa en un oasis de verano con hot buys desde...
Spengler believed the rise of a Caesar figure was inevitable once a civilization's expansion has reached unmanageable levels, creating problems internally and from external foes. The way from Alexander to Caesar is unambiguous and unavoidable, and the strongest nation of any and every culture, consciously or unconsciously, willing or unwilling, has had to tread it. From the rigor of these facts, there is no refuge. So why did he believe the West was now approaching Caesarism? A few symptoms forebode the rise of Caesarism. A battling society of nations, where the size and scale of warfare increases, an accelerating demolition of ancient forms, a forsaking of old traditions and institutions, and finally, dictatorial money economics, which uses democracy as a weapon. Every civilization headed towards Caesarism is marked by massive wars not yet seen on a scale since that culture's inception. For the West, the Napoleonic Wars, which engulfed all of Europe and introduced the possibility of continental domination, set off this period. The American Civil War, then the First World War, continued this trend, and Spengler predicted more large wars to come during the next century. He was, of course, quickly proven right with World War II, and then the Cold War, which set continent-sized adversaries against each other. At the same time as seemingly endless warfare, the civilization begins unburdening itself of traditions, norms, and long-held institutions. In the classical culture, this began circa 450 BC, around the time of Socrates, who famously questioned the foundations of Athenian society. In Western civilization, Spengler saw the Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th centuries as this same phenomenon. Once this questioning and ultimately destabilizing attitude appears in a culture, Caesarism suddenly outlines itself on the horizon. Another signal of Caesarism's imminence is the rise of money's influence throughout society. Spengler said that democracy is the political weapon of money, and the media are the means through which money operates a democratic political system. Money, not birthright or meritocracy, becomes the deciding factor in determining the course of the civilization. Those with the most money make the laws themselves in their interests, and to that end they make use of the tool that they have made for themselves, democracy. Here, democracy is simply the bought and paid for mechanism of the moneyed class. Since money controls media, lawmakers, and institutions, the oligarchs can also manipulate the people into supporting their interests. Spengler therefore pins democracy as the will of the subsidized party. Once again using the classical culture as an example, Spengler juxtaposes ancient Greece and Rome. One can understand Greek society without ever discussing money, but in Rome's late republic or empire phases, it is impossible to comprehend the political struggles and historical turning points without first following the money. Cash dominates every facet of life in late civilizations. Caesarism is thus a reaction against this system, where raw political or even physical power is wielded to subdue this dictature of money.
If you love your customers, your team needs RingCentral. It gives you an AI-powered
The question remains, how will we react? Thanks for watching this.
So, little problem with the technology. I think a little bit of that skipped, but the idea that Spengler, let's get back here. Spengler predicted that there would be this final Caesar figure that would appear. He figured that the decline of the West was happening, and he compared this to other great civilizations, but there were utterly predictable patterns, and we see it where democracy just becomes a tool of the oligarchs. A concept I've worked with since the very first video here on the channel. What I would like to suggest here, he predicted that there would be this ultimate figure, given the trajectory where he was writing about 100 years ago. He predicted that this ultimate Caesar figure would come on the stage. And a Caesar figure is a figure that people just want to give over their will and imagination to this diabolical character. And so there was this idea, and there's even people that do gematria about Trump and is he the Antichrist and so forth. Don't know. But what I would like to throw out as an idea here is that within the spectacle of empire, and if we think about, I have discussed before the heirs of Fatima, and I'll talk about them briefly today, but the heirs of Fatima, I will argue, have indeed spread throughout the world, and it is this type of collective psychosis. And indeed, I would say that we're living in now at a world level of something that seems to be apocalyptic in the terms of a great deception that's spoken about in 2 Thessalonians 2:10, a great deception because people did not love the truth. Now, when we put it in this perspective of, sort of a historical and secular perspective, that at the end of all of these empires, there was a collective psychosis and a great deception going on because people were detached from reality. They were subjects to a totalitarian rule and under techniques that separated them from reality in the sense of just basic facts and information. And when we talk about the spectacle, that's one of the features of the spectacle. People prefer the entertainment, the show, the illusion over facts. So with that in mind, if there is indeed these heirs of Russia have spread throughout the whole world, I think the final figure from now a theological perspective could be the Mashiach figure, so that the heirs of Russia are not just Trump or the West or NATO, but this Americanism and technology, and the heirs of Russia, so to speak, have spread throughout the whole world, this false messianism in preparation for this final arrival of a Caesar character. So I'm just putting that out there, and I'm going to have to take a few shows, but connect this with this idea that there is perhaps a staging going on right now to prepare for the Mashiach, and indeed all the memory hold materials that we look over. That is part of the project of the synagogue, is to prepare the world for the arrival of the Mashiach. So whether or not this is a natural trajectory or there are agents that try to work within the trajectory to steer it in a certain direction, the purpose I have here is that we get back to reality, that we're not subjected to the pull, the mimetic pull into this false reality. And I think that the managers of spectacle are going to kind of crank the dial up. And what I see coming, looking from the pattern that Carl Schmitt identified after World War I, after World War II, and the preparation for this, is state of exception situation where a lot of psychosis is introduced, a sort of vacuum of power is introduced, and then there'll be a new order to prepare us for a new world order. So with that in mind, I want to move a little bit ahead to this idea, which has to do with the state of exception. And I want to read from Giorgio Agamben here. And I will put a photo up of Giorgio Agamben in just a moment. I deal with him in both my books. Again, links are in the description. He was one of the very first philosophers I introduced on the channel. So as far as the state of exception tradition, as far as the state of exception conditions, Giorgio Agamben's central idea revolves around the idea that the state of exception, where the normal rules of law are suspended in favor of a state of emergency. I think a lot of people got a taste of that over the last 5 years. When we talk about mandates, it's not really the regular laws in place. It's really kind of a hocus pocus thing to see if you're going to go along with it. After the fact, people will say, well, we never made you do X, Y, and Z. You still had your free will. But that's very much an example of that. When we talk about the deep state in academic terminology, it is the continuation of government or a deeper government or a parapolitical government. And so that was indeed activated over the last 5 years in many countries. So for Agamben, he argues that the state of exception, while often presented as temporary, remember 6 weeks to bend the curve. We're going over there to drop a couple of them on there. What is it going to take? Maybe 2 weeks, maybe 2 months. You're there 20 years later. So we see patterns in how these promises and projects are pitched when people are sort of in a vacuum or under chaos, maybe even chaos magic's being evoked. So another key aspect is bare life, or Zoe, which he distinguishes. Let me back up a little bit and just read this again. He argues that the state of exception, while often presented as temporary, can become permanent features of the modern government, blurring the lines between law and violence. Think about the rioting going on today. Another key aspect is bare life, which he distinguishes from qualified life, bios, suggesting that the state of exception often seeks to control and define bare life as the means of exercising power. So that's a little bit philosophical. Let me break it apart for you a little bit. One of the key features here that he's going to get into is the word the camp. And it's kind of philosophical, but let me touch on it. He says, woven in between these modern democracies, remember what I just read for you, that there seems to be a certain point where you realize the true power is oligarchical. I've seen this come around quite a bit in just the last 5 years. We actually had a major figure in America campaigning out there, and Bernie Sanders, it's called End Oligarchy, or the Oligarchy Tour. That word was not used in conversation at all that I recall a year ago, 2 years ago. So it's introduced at the beginning of this channel. So it's being introduced to us in this age of externalization. But the word democracy, we're starting to see that it really is a tool of oligarchical power. That's part of the, I believe, the externalization and preparing us for a new politics. But he's going to suggest here that we start to realize there's a logic in the very germ of this project, this Masonic republic, these democracies. And the very germ of that is totalitarianism. And so I am going to touch on totalitarianism a bit. But what he said, the optimal word here is the camp. The camp is the space that is open when the state of exception begins to become the rule. So here's Giorgio Agamben. He's Italian, still alive today. He came out again. He's elderly now, and he really pointed out how the situation over the last 5 years really kind of vindicated a lot of his philosophical theories. But here he says the modern totalitarianism can be defined as the establishment, by means of the state of exception, of the legal civil war that allows for the physical elimination not only of political adversaries, but of the entire categories of citizens who, for one reason, cannot be integrated into the political system. So what I want to suggest, even if we don't completely understand this idea, is these are not separated events. Some of the controversies, and they vary in Europe, but in America, the rioting, the deportation, that this is not separated in terms of an agenda from the conflict in the Middle East. And he said that when I talk right now about the fog of war, and we talk about, what seems to be on the agenda of a new surveillance state, this is where I'm going with this. And I don't want us to get lost in, it's very common that we end up watching the news and a lot of information. And a lot of times during, the event 20 years ago, we pulled back and started to have questions. The event 5 years ago, we kind of got into the news, and, and that news pulls us into this mimetic collective mind, right? As Gustave Le Bon would say, the crowd mind. And again, we see this pattern emerging when we're kind of looking for the news, but we don't know always exactly what we're looking at. And he's going to suggest to us here that there is a logic to an agenda underneath this. And we see samples of what Agamben's saying when America, I say between what's going on in the Middle East over the last 2 years and people just being indifferent to it, the movements made just recently by the executive in America completely against international law, without a question, completely against the American Constitution. And you saw talking heads trying to debate the legality of a legislative act from 1973 in America that restricts the executive. But when we look at the understanding of Article 1 and Article 2, certainly this was not the idea of America. So fundamentally, we seem to be operating within some sort of rogue state, leading the rest of the world into this type of what Carl Schmitt would call totalitarian, a totalitarian program that seems to be designed to induce a collective psychosis. But again, this is a state of exception when we don't blink, when citizens or non-citizens are taken to foreign prisons. This is almost unprecedented. We had Guantanamo and things like that, but this is pretty. During politics as usual, people would be noticing something like this. The fact that people aren't noticing and calling it out very much is that we're slipping in to the psychosis, Carl Schmitt would say, and that we're entering a new kind of politics. We are living, even if we don't see it around us, in state of exception conditions. And along with that, there's this idea that it's been put on the agenda that not only can we take people that are on visiting people that are, here illegally, maybe questionably, maybe visiting visas, and then it's been put on the table that people that are naturalized citizens that weren't born here, completely in violation of the 14th Amendment. If you're born or naturalized in America, you're an American citizen. This is treading territory that nobody would have even opened up for a discussion only a little while ago. So the point that I'm getting to here is just to kind of recognize that we are perhaps living in what Carl Schmitt would call state of exception conditions that would parallel certain conditions before or after World War I, before or after World War II, conditions that we all had a taste of over the last 5 years. So we even see this word dropped this week over there in the Middle East, that they're now, in order to leave this country, people have to apply for exceptions committees. And I believe that's a deliberate language that ties us into the same concept that Carl Schmitt is speaking about. Certain people get certain kind of privileges under certain situations. That has to do with the very essence of life. In the 14th Amendment in America, it says no citizen shall be subjected to, the terminology is has to do with privileges. But in other words, if you're a citizen, we don't kind of pull that apart in terms, if you're a citizen, you get these rights, right? It's not if you're X, Y, or Z. So this is what's going on right now in that country in the Middle East. The Exceptions Committee established just last week, established by the Transportation Ministry, which is designated to review and prioritize humanitarian medical requests by citizens of that country in need of quickly returning to the country, will also examine applications by tourists, diplomats, foreign youths, and sports. Okay, so for Carl Schmitt, the end game here, there's a logic, a totalitarian logic threaded into democracies that call themselves liberal. And that logic is the camp. And when he wrote this, he was referring to things like World War II, Soviet camps, German camps. And so when he was writing this in the 1990s, early 2000s, it seemed a little far out. People would kind of vaguely, kind of like a FEMA camp kind of idea. But it's only when you start getting closer to the state of exception conditions that you see the logic unfolding. And what I am going to suggest here is that part of this surveillance state is there to realize the logic of the camp of which Carl Schmitt speaks. The surveillance state inside of the empire of spectacle will indeed function as the camp. We could call them also smart cities, but that is the agenda, whether we call it smart cities or FEMA camps or gulags. It's the end of totalitarian rule, but it's a unique end of rulers whose goal is world domination. And we've talked over and over again about that this is repeatedly mentioned by priests, cardinals, and bishops as part of the synagogue's agenda and part of the world domination. The logic underneath that would be to, at some point, implement the camp. And what I'm suggesting here, which I'm connecting here, connecting some dots. And that's what we do every Wednesday on Locals. That I say over and over, one of the themes of this show is we're living in an ontological war over reality. And one of the goals here, if I take us back to the very beginning, is to take us from base reality into a simulated reality. One of the ways we do that is through control of language, or totalitarian rulers do that. And so that's why Carl Schmitt opens up when we kind of create a new world order, a new reality. We're taking words from the primary reality that are at their core theological concepts, and we're repackaging them as political concepts. The ultimate goal is to bring citizens into a simulacrum where there's no way to have the visual economy to find out where those words originally came from, i.e. base reality. And I believe that's one of the goals of the camp, and indeed Palantir, is to take our will and imagination. I oftentimes use the word egregore. And egregore is when you're outside of the first reality, your will and imagination have been hijacked and put into a new visual economy. And when I say that, that includes a new political economy, a new political logic, a new politics. And so I believe Palantir is part of this ontological war of reality to get us from primary reality. And you can see in my last video when I talked about Eric Vogelin, it's reality experienced into a second reality. And he said, you have to take aspects of the first reality so it's not so obvious. You pull it over here. We see our politicians doing this today, giving these lame explanations of why they're doing what they're doing, kind of hooking it on. They hate our freedom, these kind of things. We'll get them over there so they don't get us over here. They're rehashing all of the old ones from the past. WMD, they're kind of working from that reality to get us in to a new normal. And so Palantir will be part of putting us into what we call in here, into the metaverse. It's that new reality. So yes, it's a surveillance state. Yes, it's indeed an electronic camp, but there's more of an ultimate purpose of it, which is Kabbalistic, which is that the cabal is going to define reality. So we even see that Palantir uses this term dynamic ontology. And this is a little bit heavy, but you can see in their own kind of advertisements here that there's going to be a web, a grid. And without getting too technical of it, this is an electronic means to take you from one reality into another. It's truly part of an ontological war on reality with the assistance of technology. We see here from the head guru, he's already said in public what some of the designs are. It's to control in part the human population. From a leaked document last week, we see internal charts and messages obtained that show contracting giant is helping to find the location of people flagged for deportation. And it's connected to ICE. And so that has to do with the ontological nature of defining a human being, Zoe versus full rights. And these are some of the terms that Giorgio Agamben would use, that once you're in the camp, you are in a diminished ontological state of existence. Not to get too philosophical, but I think we see evidence of that's literally part of Palantir's agenda here, to fulfill or vindicate what Giorgio Agamben was talking about, that the ultimate goal of totalitarianism is to separate human beings according to their ontological nature. When I say ontological, in a Christian perspective, God is being. All that exists is from God, and our existence and our good comes from an attachment to God. So evil is a deprivation from God. And so what they're doing is kind of defining the ontology, defining the good, separate from how God defines it. So for Giorgio Agamben, in the eyes of authority, and maybe rightly so, nothing looks more like a terrorist than the ordinary man. So again, controlling the language. And we've read that in so many of our articles. It was especially underscored in Sevilla Catholica. The idea is, first, the synagogue is going to control the resources and have a monopoly on that, and then have a monopoly on the minds. So there's a totalitarian scheming going on, and they're going to define the rights. And I'm not going to do it today, but this is also an entryway into the concept of Noahide laws. So nothing looks more like a terrorist than the ordinary man. And again, when I use 1984, remember the control of language. Good is bad, up is down, gangsters are good, and regular citizens are bad. And in a sense, there is nothing new under the sun. The final stages of empire, these categories of good and bad tend to be shifted. And I'll only briefly point out here, part of the idea that this goes back to Plato is to get that politics as usual, to fill the circle. So in an ontological world of, for example, Catholic politics and an integral system, the circle's closed. There's only the mystery between man and God. But that mystery gets hijacked and a vacuum of power is created. And a new agenda will put, I know this sounds a little bit out there, but if you're interested, come on over to Locals. It's $5 a month. And I'm going to begin in this session today going into this concept of maintaining the gap of reality and filling it in. And that's where you get to the second reality, closing the gap of the serpent. It's an ancient concept, and it's indeed used by totalitarians to close the gap. I mentioned before, when there's a transition in international power from one hegemon to another, there's always a gap that needs to be closed. So Chris Hedges mentioned Hannah Arendt. There was a lot of great work done on the nature of totalitarian regimes, what happened in World War II. That was in the 1950s. I draw on a lot of that, Leo Strauss, Hannah Arendt, we're talking here, we've talked about Eric Voegelin, and we'll talk in a moment about Juice Malou. So there's a common theme when they look at what are the objectives of totalitarian rule. And let's just go through a couple of quotes from some of these books. So Hannah Arendt, the very origin, and then this is Giorgio Gammon. He's looking at the origin to understand the trajectory. The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convicted Nazi or dedicated communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, true or false, no longer exists. So the baseline always comes back to moving you from one reality to another, to problematize your perception of reality and redefine it for you. In an ever-changing, incomprehensible world, the masses had reached the point where they would, at the same time, believe everything and nothing, think that everything was possible and nothing was true. So any human being subjected to the right conditions can fall into this separation from reality. Part of why I'm sort of highlighting these things is I think that when we kind of see the herd moving in one direction, we can hopefully separate our consciousness from it and hopefully keep our feet grounded in reality. If everybody always lies to you, the consequence is not that you believe the lies, but rather that nobody believes anything any longer. Oftentimes I talk to my students. Indeed, I talked to my students this morning and had them write just brief reaction papers to the events of the weekend. And even though they watch the TV, a year or two ago, most students would have just wrote what they heard on the television. But because of TikTok and social media and these things being externalized, because they want to problematize the very nature of democracy, that almost to a person, the response was, I just don't know what to believe anymore. And I believe that's what she's describing here. People just don't know what to believe anymore. They have the capacity to question the lie. I think that's part of the reason for the externalization. But this is where people, I think, are corralled to go in order to await a Caesar figure or perhaps a Mashiach figure. Walter Benjamin. And again, I mentioned in this extensive book I'm trying to make my way through. It's very thick, and it's called How the CIA's doctrinal warfare program changed the Catholic Church. And he was writing extensively about Walter Lippmann. And I go into my book in chapter 13. I write about Lippmann as well, and how the CIA was using these ideas that were being taken from social science research and applying them to modern propaganda techniques in order to achieve a message. One of the objectives to change the Catholic mind was to get them to accept a type of Americanism and to kind of blur the lines between the American project and Catholicism. And I think they were largely successful, at least preparing the minds for Vatican II. So Walter Lippmann would write here, we are all captives of the pictures in our heads. Our belief that the world we have experienced is the world that really exists. I lecture extensively on Walter Lippmann, and he was one of his key things that he was an analyst of was modern media. And he looked at how the brain processed information in an age of reading, and then with the advent of motion pictures. And one of the discoveries he had is that people are pretty much subjected to the pictures of their head. If you can monopolize the media, again, with the age of, with the exploration into totalitarianism in the 1950s, why did Germans believe what they did? Why did the Soviets, how did they conquer the minds and hearts of those people? Propaganda brought us a long ways. And again, Spangler, to some extent, would say you can also look at the end of empire as part of the explanation. But the real question here is, who controls the images in your head? In Plato's cave, people believed the shadows on the wall instead of the original. And that's instead of the total reality, they were only subjected to a secondary reality or a copy of reality. And the question at hand could be that moment we question, who's mastering these puppets. It is an important question to ask to help us bring ourselves back to the fullness of reality. And so we are all captives of the pictures in our heads. And again, we know the research has said these smartphones have brought us even further into alternative reality, and the advent of AI threatens to bring us even into another level of simulacrum. So again, it's something we could be prepared of when we couch this information in terms of the fact that there is in place totalitarian rule, even though we might not always see it, that it might be sort of silent and creeping in the background, that it might have an agenda, indeed, that it might have an ancient agenda. Indeed, I argue that it is the synagogue, and it's at enmity with the church, and its objectives are to destroy Christianity. Not just the church, but our understanding of Christianity in our minds, bodies, and souls, and the way we live. Photographs have the kind of authority over imagination today. Writing this 100 years ago. Which the printed world has understood. And the spoken word before that. They seem utterly real. Let me rephrase that. They seem utterly real. We're lost in the illusion. He's talking about a fully developed simulacrum 100 years ago. Motion pictures and mechanical reproduction of newspapers and propaganda made this possible. The right colors, the right tones, the right frequencies. You repeat the lie enough, people will believe it. They seem utterly unreal. They come, we imagine, directly to us without human meddling, and they are the most effortless food for the mind conceivable. So just a little bit about Jush Malou, who also to some extent draws upon Lippmann's work. And he's looking at a book called The Rape of the Mind. He who dictates and formulates the words and phrases we use, he who is master of the press and radio, is master of the mind. Repeat mechanically your assumptions and suggestions, diminish the opportunity for communicating dissent and opposition. This is the formula for political conditioning of the masses. And again, we all saw that over the last 5 years at a worldwide perspective that most everybody believed an insane proposition that something should be injected that usually should take 5 or 10 years of research, that you're going to be strongly coerced into taking or persuaded into taking an experimental injection that has no liability. That any rational person wouldn't do this. But what we call the crowd mind is really at a world stage. And the information, if you had any dissent, you were kicked off the platforms. All of the comedians were paid off. The entertainers were paid off. The sports figures were paid off. We know this now. So that all you heard was just shut up and trust the science. And most people fell for it. And so sometimes I remember growing up, we'd ask, like, how did Germany or how did the Soviets end up becoming subject to these ideas? And we now see them happening in real time around us. The task of the totalitarian propagandist is to build special pictures in the minds of citizens. This is from Joost Malou. It's to build special pictures in the minds of the citizenry so that finally they will no longer see and hear with their own eyes and ears, but will look at the world through the fog of official catchwords and will develop the automatic responses appropriate to the totalitarian mythology. And again, we saw it 5 years ago. We saw it during the left and the right in World War II. And when we look at the state of Catholicism right now, it has both mostly been inculcated into these Americanisms so that people no longer realize that these ideas are not Catholic. The tension of a mysterious danger is even more unbearable than danger itself. Again, I said within the church fills the gap. The church is comprehensive. There are certain mysteries because the way the church defines reality, it's uniquely situated because reality, and this is a strong proposition, that Christ is reality. Because we live in a world that the millennial age isn't something to come when the Mashiach or the third temple comes. The millennial age is now. So through the church's perspective, we live in an inaugurated eschatology. Sometimes it's said already, not yet. We have an eye on the beatific vision, but we don't perfectly see. At the end of time, in the new heaven and the new earth, that incorporation that we now participate in the mystical body will be realized. But we have a glimpse into the beatific vision, and that involves both the transcendent, the heavenly frame, and the earthly, the transcendent and the immanent frame of reality together. So Christ was transcendent, heavenly, became man, the Logos became flesh and came into our reality and ascended. It threaded the two worlds that were separated. This is, Catholic theology. So we live in this world where we're participating in two realities. We're citizens, as St. Augustine would say, in part of two worlds. Ideally, you want to be strongly situated in just the city of man, but we do things in the city of God, but we also participate in part in the world. So that mystery, we don't understand the heavenly completely, and it's a mystery. The Holy Eucharist is a mystery. The Trinity is a mystery that we ponder, and that mystery gets hijacked. And that's what he's speaking of here. The tension of the mystery gets hijacked. And he drops here, this is Joost Malou. The tension of the mysterious danger is even more unbearable than the danger itself. People hate the vacuum. It's the key word to get you from one reality to another. They hate the vacuum of an unknown situation. They want security. They even prefer war to the insecure expectation of war with its threat of enemy surprise. This vague, fearful expectation acts on their fantasies. They anticipate all kinds of mysterious dangers. They begin to provoke them. It is the evocation of the fear and danger in order to escape the tension of reality. So right now, the idea, and scripture talks about this, wars and rumors of wars. That's exactly where the totalitarian regime that's bigger than Trump exists, the real levers of power. And they want us all in this era of wars and rumors of war to get lost in the spectacle, in the information that's kind of not very full information. Even if you think about the rational actor model, it's based on this idea that we maximize our utility, we have a vision of goals, we have facts, we can weigh the evidence, and it's also predicated upon complete information. But we're in the fog of war. We don't know exactly what's going on in these areas. So we sort of get drawn in sometimes to very incomplete information. And sometimes that's an entry point into this sort of group thinking. And that's why I think what Albert Pike suggested, that this could be, even though it's unfathomable, hard to imagine, that they could be pulling us into a theatrical show, the objective of which is to capture our will and imagination first and foremost, and take us from one reality to another in preparation for a new order. So with that in mind, I would just like to read a little snippet. I'm writing a book called Saints of the Apocalypse, and I'm opening myself up. Part of what we believe is the communion of saints. So some of the great saints that I believe speak to our age. And I would like to draw just a bit here from the vision of Our Lady of Fatima, 1917. She warns us about the quote unquote heirs of Russia, that briefly I've called let's just read it. That was not only a prophecy about communism, but indeed explained a broader spiritual diagnosis of the modern world's descent into false messianism, dehumanizing ideologies, and the rejection of God. In our time, these heirs have mutated into new forms: technocratic domination through artificial intelligence, the psychological control of media spectacle, and the spiritual confusion surrounding perpetual war, particularly in the Middle East. Her message remains urgent. Only by returning to truth, repentance, and supernatural faith can humanity resist the empire of spectacle and the apocalyptic consequences of its rebellion. She mentions that Russia would spread the heirs throughout the world. While this clearly pointed to the rise of atheistic communism, Our Lady's warnings transcends political regimes. The core concern was spiritual, about the rejection of Christ and replacing him with man-made systems promising utopia and delivering destruction. Now we live in what I have termed the spectacle of empire, where images, not truths, dominate. In our age, this spectacle has been turbocharged by artificial intelligence. I do want to dare to suggest in some cases this volleying back and forth. We don't know exactly what's going on, and it's okay just to have a little bit of reservation and not completely get lost in the sauce. In our age, this spectacle has been turbocharged by artificial intelligence capable of generating synthetic realities, rewriting narratives, and replacing human discernment with algorithmic control. Social media platforms driven by AI manipulate public consciousness, eroding our capacity for contemplation and truth. This is the new dialectic, not class struggle, but data-driven perception warfare. as reality is reframed by curated feeds, deep fakes, and predictive algorithms. Humanity becomes passive, distractive, and spiritually numb. Exactly what Our Lady warned against when she said the greatest danger was a world that offends God too much. Fatima calls us to prayer, penance, and an inward conversion is a direct antidote to this form of techno-idolatry. The rosary is, I would suggest, our optimal weapon at this point. The church itself is not exempt. Many Catholics sense a profound disorientation. Moral teachings are blurred, liturgical reverence has often eroded, and faith is too frequently reduced to activism and therapeutic language. In some corners, the church appears to adopt the methods of the world: marketing, branding, the synod of synodality, or the synodality of publicity, rather than proclaiming the gospel in its undiluted supernatural power. This is the internalization of the empire of spectacle, a church that mirrors the world rather than sanctifying it. And just 5 supernatural means of resistance offered at Fatima. The Immaculate Heart of Mary will triumph, but not before souls suffer greatly if they do not repent. The Sacred Heart of Jesus, to which Our Lady points, remain the source of divine mercy and justice. The Rosary becomes more powerful, and we've been told through prophecy, more efficacious than ever before. More efficacious than any AI networks when it's prayed in faith. And finally, penance. In a world of pleasure and distraction, it becomes the most counter-cultural act. So this has been a little bit of 1984, a way to think about totalitarianism, that it has a logic to it that we saw that's worked throughout the ancient world into today. We considered some of the technological applications to totalitarian techniques, especially as they've advanced throughout the 20th century into the age now that we're living in artificial intelligence. And we briefly reminded ourselves that that there is a solution, and the church offers the solution. And Our Lady, I believe, is calling us to return to reality. So if you'd like to hear more, I'm going to go into the actual chapter in our local section, and I'll pick apart some of the pieces that we discussed here.